Economic inequality, time poverty, care burdens, and lack of resources, household structurings, and societal norms. So to go over some of these, right, economic inequality is pretty self-explanatory. Women tend to be the ones that are paid the least, and that's true in this country as well as all the other countries too. Yo, welcome back. Hope y'all doing marvelous as always. Y'all miss me? I know it's been a minute, but I've been preparing for the next series here, which we're gonna go into 200, and this is gonna talk about world hunger, right? Also, y'all like the glasses? I'm saying? These are my nice little Ray-Bans that I got a couple years back, I'm saying? Now, just so y'all know, these is for reading and not for seeing. Luckily, I got 20/20 vision, so I'm trying to, maintain that as much as possible. Take this time to go into session number 201, right? And this is gonna go over dimensions of food securities. Basically, when you're food insecure, that means going into the next, set of bullets, you're lacking, normally one. All it takes is for you to lack in one, but you can lack up to all four of, what I'm about to go into next. These are the different types of food securities, right? There's four types. You have availability, then you have access, and you have consumption/utilization, and then stability over time, right? When I say world hunger, I don't just mean the US, but of course I mean all over the world, right? I mean globally, because, the US as well as other countries, especially, underdeveloped and even developing ones, they still deal with world hunger. So availability, though, is basically where, that measures the availability of food, right? Is food available to you? Access, what's your access like? The food may be available by way of, food markets, right? Like, farmers markets, fresh food places and things like that, grocery stores, because, there is what's called food deserts that some people live in, right? Usually food deserts are areas where there's no real access to foods, and specifically nutritious food. You being in a food desert, that's gonna affect your access as well. Some other things that may affect access is gonna be like, for example, inflation. Inflation pretty much covers just about all four of these items, right? Because with inflation, as we all know, prices go up, and that of course will affect, all of these here items, your availability, your access, all of that, right? Even if not for inflation, another factor that might affect access is, economic downfalls, right? Like personal economic downfall. So maybe, you lose your job, or maybe you're living in poverty. Consumption/utilization. So how is that food being, the consumption of food, how is it being used, right? So what that basically means is the food that you do have access and availability to, is it being stored right? Okay, because certain foods, perishable items, things like that, we all know, that has to be stored right. Okay. There's foods that also have expiration dates, foods that's got to be eaten within a certain amount of time. In keeping with storing foods and whatnot, are you, making sure that you're not eating food that's spoiled, or foods that's gonna, give you any kind of gastrointestinal issues, for example, right? Because if you're eating foods that, you're not able to keep, your body can't pull nutrition from, that also is going to affect your consumption/utilization, right? So things like that. And I'm going to go into gastrointestinal, issues and things like that here in the next section. But the last food security is stability over time. Okay, so what that means is with the first three, food has to be stable. Okay, again, I already mentioned certain factors like inflation or economic downfalls and downturns and things like that. And even, personally, maybe, you live in poverty or what have you. That's going to affect stability over time. Like things can change, right? You lose your job or what have you. Obviously, the foods that you eat, that you've been used to eating, you may not have. That'll affect stability. That affects your consistent ability to maintain, getting said foods. So now we're gonna go into US and global numbers in 2025. I know I wrote 2025 here, but because 2025 is still being evaluated, the most recent data we have is actually going to be 2024, which is pretty much in keeping with, statistics and, data reporting and gathering and things like that. So instead, this is actually going to be 2024. But with that said, in the US, about 48 million or so people suffer from, food inadequacy, access and things like that. Now, the severity is about 7.2 million households, with 5.4%, which equates to about 7.2 million households have very low food security, or they experienced such in 2024. Meaning they had to either skip meals or, they faced a reduction of sorts, right? Because of lack of resources or what have you. Children, now women and children, I wrote this down here already, but I guess, we're kind of, we might as well go into it. It's all gonna tie in together. But women and children, they tend to be the most at risk for food insecurities. About 14 million children were, food insecure in 2024. Now, as far as globally, because that was just the US, globally, about 673 million were undernourished in 2024. It represents a slight improvement from 2023 because around that time we were still experiencing, effects from COVID. Single parent households, right? Single parent households that are led by women specifically, those tend to be the ones that are the most food insecure. I'm gonna save that for later because I actually wrote it down later on. So when it comes to globally, the area that suffers usually the most from food insecurity is the sub-Saharan Africa regions. Okay, so Yemen, Nigeria, those are the areas that, tend to, face food insecurities often. And, even contaminated drinking water, which I'll also go into because I added that in here as well. It all ties in, and I'll show you how. I want to go into some undernutrition causes in developing countries. So I mentioned one factor, poverty, right? So when you're living in poverty, obviously, it affects your ability to be food secure, right? You tend to be more food insecure because you don't have access to nutritious food usually, or availability and even consumption utilization, right? As well as stability over time. Usually poverty affects up to all four. Next, almost exclusive reliance on plant sources for nutritional intake. So the reason why that's important, right? The reason why that can cause undernutrition, especially in developing countries, usually it may not affect us that much here in the US, but it may affect developing countries because here in the US, we do have more than plant-based options. Overseas though, in developing countries and even underdeveloped countries, they may only have plant sources to choose from. Later on in this series, I'm gonna talk about a condition called pica, which is basically where, children eat it's usually experienced by children. But what pica is it's children's inability to get, good food. So what they do is instead they eat, like grass or even paper. They eat things that typically aren't edible to humans. But I'm going to talk about that in the later series because, when I was in school for this undergraduate, certificate for nutrition and wellness, one of the things that we had to do is watch a video, and it talked about how, children experience pica in underdeveloped nations, and, it really did kind of, pull on my heartstrings a bit. So I'm going to save that one for later. But the reason why that's important is because if you remember, I actually talked about this in a few videos in my 100 series sessions, right? So I talked about complete and incomplete protein sources. Oftentimes plant proteins tend to be incomplete sources. Now, not all of them, of course, right? I remember going over tofu, tempeh, and soybeans, which is like, edamame, which is soybeans and pods. Anything derived from soy usually is a complete full source, right? It has a full amino acid profile, right? But other plant-based sources such as beans, right? So legumes, like lentils, black beans, pinto beans, stuff like that. Kidney beans, red beans, they tend to be incomplete sources, which usually means you have to supplement those sources with something else to make it complete. That's something that, underdeveloped countries have to deal with because they may not have access to complete sources like that. So instead they're relying on completely plant-based sources for the most part. Then we have infectious diseases as another cause of undernutrition in developing countries, right? So like gastrointestinal, issues, for example, right? So I already mentioned a couple of countries that go through this, but, I mentioned Yemen and Nigeria, Ethiopia, Somalia, basically sub-Saharan countries. They tend to go through, undernutrition by way of gastrointestinal issues, or diseases, infectious diseases, right? Drinking water tends to be very contaminated over there, right? They tend to not have, a good system for drinking water. And, Of course, the reason why that's a problem is because, when you get sick like that, when you try to eat food, maybe you don't keep it down, or, because you have such an infectious disease, it may affect your body's ability to pull nutrients from whatever food you're eating. Or if you can't keep it down, of course, you're gonna, lose out on the nutrients anyway, right? You're not gonna keep them. You end up losing nutrients. And that, of course, leads to, other more compounded issues, such as increased healthcare costs, progressive loss of wages, because, when you're sick, you typically can't work, especially if you're very severely sick, So there's that. And then you have decreased mental and physical development. And that's more so for children. As they, age, they develop, right? As an adult, you typically are already there, So this is more for children. And pregnant women too, I might add, right? Because pregnant women, they're carrying a baby. And that leads me to women and children, right? Women and children in poor families and households tend to be the most affected. And that's approximately 31.9% of women. So here's some of the reasons why they may, end up being affected the most by this. Economic inequality, time poverty, care burdens, and lack of resources, household structurings, and societal norms. So to go over some of these, right? Economic inequality is pretty self-explanatory. Women tend to be the ones that are paid the least. And that's true in this country as well as all the other countries too. I mean, there's still some other countries where women don't necessarily work outside the home. The US was just like that, not too long ago. I mean, it wasn't really that long ago when you think about it. But even still to this day, there's a bit of a wage gap or a wage inequality between men and women. So that affects women, especially if they're, leading the household by themselves and they have kids. It affects their ability to be able to feed themselves and, the kids that they may have. So that also leads into time poverty and care burden, right? So essentially, like I said, single mother-led households, they find that, because their care burdens, right? If it's just them taking care of the kids, oftentimes they forego feeding themselves so that their kids can have meals. It doesn't necessarily have to be women and children. Sometimes it is just one or the other. It's very sad either way. So then you have lack of resources, okay? And what that essentially means is, like land, credit, and, certain agricultural inputs. Women typically tend not to have access to those types of things. Then you have household structuring, right? Now, single mothers, right? Specifically, single mother-led households, they tend to have they tend to have more issues, when it comes to child care and housing expenses, right? Oftentimes women tend to work more of the low wage, more informal job with low benefits, right? So all of that, just ties in together. And so then you have, and of course, women, that's not to say women don't have full-time jobs, but, if it's just them and then they have kids, it makes it more difficult for them to work full-time jobs. So, especially in developing countries, women tend to opt for the part-time, lower wage jobs just so that they can still be able to take care of their kids. But then again, that affects their ability to feed themselves and the kids. Because, low benefits, that means child care is likely not going to be covered. And then, of course, societal norms. So, of course, with that being said, in some contexts, as we may already know, women are expected to sacrifice their own food intake so that they can make sure their children eat. And that, of course, directly affects their nutritional intake. It affects, their food security. They become food insecure. Now for the next section, right, I want to go ahead and, talk about hunger and some undernutrition concepts. We have food insecurity versus nutrition insecurity. So I wrote that because I wanted to make sure that y'all knew the difference between the two, okay? Just because you're food secure doesn't necessarily mean you're also nutrition secure. For example, right, you could be food secure, but not nutritionally secure if the type of food you're eating is not allowing your body to pull from all the nutrients that it needs in order for your bodily processes to, continue moving, right? Continue functioning. Cell reproduction, hormone regulation, things like that is important, right? And you typically get those from the micronutrients, which I have a video about. Hunger and undernutrition concepts, one of the reasons that exists is because of micronutrition deficiencies. So micronutrients, like your vitamins, okay? Those are your vitamins and minerals. So that being iron, calcium, those are all, well, iron is a trace mineral. Then you got your major ones like calcium, potassium, sodium, things like that. Then you got your vitamins, of course, A, B, C, D, E, K, you know what I'm saying? You got all those, and they all have a specific duty to your body to help, your bodily processes roll right along. You can be food secure, but not nutrition secure, okay? For example, if you live in a poor area, what do you likely have around you in a poverty-stricken neighborhood? Maybe you have fast food joints, right? Typically, you tend to have a lot of fast food joints. We all know why that's a problem, right? If that's all you're eating. If it's every now and again, it's not a problem. But if all you're eating is fast food, you could be nutritionally insecure because fast food doesn't necessarily have all the nutrients that your body needs in order for, your body to keep on living, in order to make sure your body's not insecure in that way. Also, I should note that people who are food insecure, they can come in different sizes, right? A person can be really skinny, really thin, and be, food insecure and nutritionally insecure. Vice versa too, a person can be obese, and you may think because they're obese, they're not really, food insecure, right? I've actually heard that talking point a lot. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, they're so obese, they're so fat, they eating all the food in the world. Okay, well, that may be true, but the type of food they eat can determine whether or not they're nutritionally secure or not. You can still be obese and lack certain vital minerals and vital nutrients, right? Vital, minerals, okay? Certain, important and crucial micronutrients that your body needs. You can still be obese and lack those. You being obese doesn't really mean anything, you know what I'm saying? You being obese, you can have a higher fat content, which is of course the case with those that are obese. They tend to carry more visceral fat, but you can be more fat and lack proteins, for example, which I'm going to talk about here next. Protein calorie undernutrition. We got 3 different types of conditions here, right? We have an acute condition, and that's known as wasting, also called marasmus at its most severe form. Marasmus is basically wasting, right? So this is where you're not getting enough protein, and you get to the point where your body will start wasting, so to speak. So you may notice some more more pronounced face and more pronounced structures and your joints and things like that. And essentially you become all skin and bones. Your ribs start to protrude. You may have seen pictures like that of children who's real skinny, so skinny to the fact that you can see their ribs and their bones. That's wasting, in most cases. And in those cases, right, muscle mass decreases so much, you lose tone, that your body ends up metabolizing tissues. Individual could still remain alert if they have wasting, but it's a very serious case, right? When your body starts to, eat up at its own tissues just to, keep your body going. Common case to help solve this issue would be to, feed proteins to a child, right? But feed protein, sources to a child. But if the case continues to advance, nourishment may need to be gathered through some sort of intravenous, method, or via a tube through the nose and into the stomach. Protein calorie undernutrition, you have a severe acute condition, which is kwashiorkor. Pretty sure that's how you pronounce it, which is basically an imbalance of protein compared to oils and fats and carbs. Because again, this is children that deal with this the most, but kwashiorkor is essentially where the skin becomes ulcerous, the hair color starts to lighten, things like that. And this differs from marasmus in the way that their demeanor can start to be they start to go into depression, and they may start to become disengaged and have a withdrawn demeanor. That's one of the common cases for kwashiorkor. Because it's severe acute, if this continues, the child can essentially die, unless of course they're given proteins, right? They're given food. It's a slow process, but the more protein they eat over time, the less the condition can become, right? The less severe the condition is, and they can even get themselves out of that stage. Chronic condition is known as stunting, right? That's the other one that can be, that a child can have. Stunting, most of us know what that is, right? When your growth is stunted, that's usually as a result of, you not being fed, especially in this case, we're talking about protein calorie undernutrition. So this happens within the first 27 months of the child's life, right? It's a combo of pregnancy and to the first 18 months, right? Basically what this means is, right, the first 18 months of a child's life after being born, so a year and a half, right, after they've been born, that's the most crucial point for a child to get all the nutrition that they need right when they're born, because when a woman is pregnant, it's still important then as well. The type of things that a woman pregnant puts in her body is very important to fetus development, okay? Because a fetus can easily, if you're not careful, right? If a pregnant woman is not really mindful about what they eat and the type of nutrition that they get, or if they're nutritionally insecure, what can happen is, a fetus can end up, experiencing retardation before it even exits the womb. You know what I'm saying? Just as an example, right? And with that said, the WHO, right, the World Health Organization, they use anthropometry. Take a child and they measure their height and weight per their references, and then they use standard deviation to come to a conclusion, right? So when they go to measure the child's weight and height, and they use their reference height, right? They take the weight and they, put it up against their reference height. If the standard deviation is less than 2, then the WHO will classify the said child as wasted. If the standard deviation is then less than 3, then they'll, classify that child as having having severe acute malnutrition. Micronutrient deficiencies, this is pretty much going to take y'all back to my sessions 103A through 103D. Micronutrient deficiencies is, a concept of hunger and undernutrition. So that's why I did that video first. I kind of structured my, sessions as somewhat of a curriculum. Some things you had to see first before I could get to the next part. There's a reason why. If you go back and watch sessions 103A through D, then you'll watch the sessions where I talked about the water-soluble vitamins. That was 103A. 103B was the fat-soluble vitamins, so that's going to be A, D, E, and K, whereas the water-soluble ones is vitamin C, vitamin A, vitamin B, right? All the B vitamins, so that's going to be your niacin, your riboflavin, your folate, folic acid, things like that, right? And 103C, that's going to be the major minerals: calcium, potassium, sodium, things like that. You then have the trace minerals at 103D. That's iron, zinc, magnesium, things like that. Manganese, I believe, was another one, and a few others. So in that video, I talked about each one having what's called a deficiency disease and symptoms, as well as toxicity disease and symptoms. So as we all know, deficiency is where, you're deficient in something, right? That essentially means that you're not getting enough of something. And when it comes to micronutrients, if you continue to be deficient, you could end up contracting a certain deficiency disease or, a deficiency symptom, right? Symptoms is like headaches, things like that, nausea, your ability to kind of like, your hormone imbalances, those are symptoms. Deficiency disease might be like, for example, iron. Anemia is essentially associated with lack of iron. So anemia would be the deficiency disease. Whereas you got toxicity, that's where you're getting too much of something, right? That's when you're overindulging. Vitamins and minerals, there's a toxicity symptom as well as a toxicity disease. So going back to what I said about people being overweight or obese, what have you, people thinking that those people just eat like all the food, in the world, so they can't be insecure, food or nutritionally. Well, that's a lie. You could be, if you go back and watch those sessions, an obese person can still experience those. When I talked about, I had a 2-part diet types video, and there was the one I talked about, the carnivore diet, which a lot of people swear by, right? And in the carnivore diets, that's of course the diet where you eat pretty much nothing but meats, no veggies or nothing else, right? Well, that may work for some people, but the problem with that is, when you're not eating veggies or you're not eating any other like carbs or what have you, because meats is not really a good source of carbs either. The problem with that can be, depending on the person, eating a whole lot of meats means that you may miss out on some of the micronutrients that your body needs. The vitamins and minerals that your body needs, some of those you may not get in meat. For example, vitamin K, right? Vitamin K typically comes out of leafy greens. So that'd be like broccoli broccoli's not leafy, but broccoli is where you can get vitamin K from. But mostly leafy greens being spinach, collard greens. Vitamin K is the vitamin that helps with blood clotting. So whenever you cut yourself or what have you, your body sends cells to, help repair that cut. And, it starts to, it clots essentially to stop the bleeding. Vitamin K helps with that. You don't get vitamin K really from meats. So if you're on a carnivore diet, it's something to keep in mind. There's nuance with everything, as I always try to maintain on this channel. I also try to maintain everything in moderation. That's gonna pretty much end this one. hope y'all enjoyed it, man. This is pretty much going to be the setting going forward. I'm going to use one of my mounted TVs, or maybe one of my rolling TVs that I have in here. So I hope y'all have enjoyed this so far. I wanted to talk about the dimensions of food securities, and I hope y'all stick with me as we go through session 200 and 300 series. And that's going to be it, y'all. Appreciate you for tuning in as always. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, hit my comment section. I do check them. Also, subscribe too if you feel inclined. Till next time though, I'll see y'all later. Take care.